Hey, and welcome to the Center for the History of Video Games, Technology, and Critical Play. I'm Sean Smith, along with Jeff Lawler, and we are talking this week. We're taking a kind of different tact and trying something new, and that is we're going to Twitch our curriculum development that we're doing in class, looking at how we use Twine in class, the game engine Twine, with our history students, and why we are changing some of that curriculum up this semester. So as we do this, bring Jeff into this space as well. This is us.
Hello there.
So we are the Center for Critical Play. One of the things that we are trying to do is to bring games, both their critical use and critical reading of them, into our history courses, but also we're trying to get our students to start thinking about different ways of historical production, and one of those different ways is using games.
Yeah, so Sean and I have both used Twine in this context in our classroom for a number of years. We used it in our lower division classes and our upper division classes. And we've had a lot of different experiences, and we've changed a lot of our approach, changed a lot of our prompts and expectations too over the last, what has it been, 6 or 7 years maybe that we've been doing this now. And what we ultimately want to do here is we're going to kind of just live stream our own development of a game, but we'll get there. I think where we wanted to start was thinking about the sort of challenges that we and our students have faced in using Twine to develop a historical game. And from there, we'll talk about some of those issues, and from there, I hope we can kind of see where Sean and I have ended up at this point, and how we hopefully or expectantly have some ideas to remedy our students, or to facilitate our students' ability to create a good historical game.
Right, and that's going to be the challenge, right? One of the things that we decided to do was to challenge ourselves. We had been doing this teaching for several years now, and making seems really harsh, but having our students make these games, and never really sat down. We made smaller versions of the games. We'd made demonstration versions of the games in class. We would show them how to use various functions of Twine, but we've never really sat down to make a serious version of a game ourselves. And one of the things that our students, I think, had a lot of trouble with is we were throwing them into the deep end of this experience without really any kind of modeling. And so this semester we kind of started thinking about ways in which we could maybe model the experience for them and give us that, let us experience what they've been experiencing in some ways.
Yeah. And I think the idea is we've modeled, but we've modeled in parts, right? And so the idea here is if we can demonstrate a full production with, as we imagine it now, all the bells and whistles, whether they use those or not is another thing, but that's not only the sort of direct application of Twine, but how do you make Twine tell a narrative, and how do you incorporate historical stories into that? And this being said, I think now we wanted to talk about some of the challenges our students face, but also some of the benefits that we get for this, and our students get from this. We wouldn't continue doing this. I think that may be obvious if we didn't think our students and ourselves were taking something away from it, but anything that can improve
right, for sure,
the classroom experience is a bonus.
Right. And so as we've been kind of experimenting with this for the last few years, several things have kind of come to to the fore when students, I don't want to say they complain, because they don't, but they do express concern as they're building these games. And there are things that we also see in the games that are not concerning, but that could be, I think, made a little more explicit in the way that they approach those games. And so from a student's perspective, right, the two big pieces I think that kind of come out of that, and the one that most of our history students especially express, is just the fear of using a new medium in many ways, right? They've been, when they come to our class, most of them have had our methods courses, most of them have had our institution's theory course, and they're pretty well equipped to write a traditional research paper. And in many ways, that's what they're kind of, not only are they accustomed to, but that's where they're comfortable. And what we're asking them to do is to sometimes take that traditional research paper and convert it into a non-traditional form like a game. And that's where it kind of breaks their brains a little bit. How do you express a traditional historical thesis in gaming form, right? In a kind of narrative-based game form. And for them, there's a struggle there, as well as the kind of fear of the coding part of it, right? And Twine, for those who've never played around with Twine isn't coding heavy by any stretch of the imagination. It's, I would kind of compare it to maybe being able to use Markdown or HTTP, maybe a little bit of CSS. And if you want to bend Twine into to kind of decorate it and to do interesting things with it, you're getting into some of that kind of basic coding for variables and other things like that. And I think when our students hear code, that's when they have that kind of freak out moment, right? So I've been really taking to just calling it making instead of coding the game.
That's fair, and there's a distinction there to make too. Is most students have taken our history methods course, so they know how to do history, but the students who have taken digital methods, right, do come in without that fear, I found, right, because they've learned these other skills, and which is a history course for us, a digital methods class. And in this sense, the challenges that our students may face are kind of those two parts. There's the one part, the fear of making, if you will, coding, because they don't know, they're not familiar with that, and I can understand that. Like, that's something new that you're not used to. And then the other set of challenges, which are what we'll talk about, are all those sort of ways to make a game. Right. How do you create an environment? How do you create a character? How do you tell a compelling story? How do you create meaning out of this? And so even if they can do the history methods, the coding, if you will, and then the narrative creation, the storytelling, I'm writing a novel, essentially. There's this pyramid of things they have to balance. And that's much different than their traditional ways of writing a, 2,000 word essay or something like that.
And I think there's also a little bit of discomfort that comes in, we're giving them the freedom to write what we're calling plausible historical narratives. So as we've asked them to create these games, we want them, the characters that they're ultimately creating are fictive characters. They're fictitious versions of a 19th century banker. They're a fictional version of a 18th century soldier in the American Revolution, whatever it might be. And for many of them, there's, I think, a temptation to take the fiction part too far and to apply 21st century situations and contexts to those characters that they're creating that wouldn't necessarily be a part of the world that their character is situated in, right? And so we're giving them this challenge of writing a historically plausible, I don't like the word, I think we both have talked about not liking the word accurate, right? Because we're talking about an interpretive medium in history anyway. But creating a plausible backdrop for these stories to exist in, and creating meaningful choices for the characters that they're creating that are consistent with the time period and the choices that that character that they've chosen would be engaged in, right? I use as an example, I've had students who write about the suffrage movement pretty consistently. It's one of a fairly common topic in these games.
In your lower division.
In the lower division courses, yeah. And there's always, I'm a maid in a wealthy person's house, and I'm energized and want to go, right, to take to the picket lines and go fight for suffrage. And it's so when do you find the time to do that? How are you going to get off of work? What are your literary skills or literacy skills as somebody who is in the working class, who may not have been subjected to the educational system, etc., right? But they just make the assumption that everybody has learned, everybody has a kind of equality within the context of their understanding of the past, and this challenges them to, I would like to say that it challenges them to find a pathway to historical empathy, right? That by crafting a character, they learn more about the limitations, hopefully, on that character, or the kind of the way in which time placed the limitations on these characters, and maybe brings them to a better understanding of that kind of the things that hold back characters.
Yeah, that's a tricky issue. I think
Right.
there's these benefits and these challenges to students when they have this freedom to choose a character or story or narrative. And the one thing is, and Sean and I have found this consistently, whether it's lower division or upper division, is the freedom to choose really gives, this is one of the big bonuses, is they tell stories that they really want to tell. They tell stories that speak from who they are, where they come from. Or, we have a lot of stories about women. We have a lot of stories about minoritized people, a variety of different characters who, particularly if in the 172 class coming out of high school, stories were just not told. And here they're free to explore those stories, which is really great, right? They have this opportunity to do that. And then the flip side of it is, I think for most people, is the idea of disassociating yourself from your own values and ideas from those in the historical past. And that's even true for our upper division students. That's true for humans in general, to disaggregate that idea. But the bonus there is that's the teachable moment where you can really, if you can get into those games with the students, give them a sense that these were different people in some ways, and we can't expect that they could just leave their work. And I think this plays into the idea that a lot of our students play games, and when students take a couple of our gaming courses where they make games and learn history, is the games that they play, there's not often meaningful choice. There is just choice there to make the game play, if you will, to move whatever narrative is there. It's not necessarily historically related or meaningful. And when we are talking about meaning, we're talking about having that historical moment tell a particular historical story that's relevant and reasonable, right? Reasonably accurate. If we're going to bring that word back into it. But that's the thing, right? If we can explore that tension, I think we look for those moments of tension where there are moments of learning for students. Then they can get that telling the story of this suffragette from the mid-19th century is also exploring class.
Yeah.
Is also not just gender, exploring class. It's exploring ethnicity and race. It's exploring a multiple of education. All of these things that are really necessary. And one other thing there, and as Sean mentioned, we sometimes use the term historically realistic character. Let's create them. It's a figment, right? But we can bring all these different characteristics in. If we're so bold to say, to collapse realistic characteristics into one character, we might have a character that isn't real, but tells a story to the person playing it, and
is a composite of an actual person.
Is it a composite of an actual person, which then makes, because they see the gameplay, and I know Sean, both and I have other students play the games, because the idea is to make the game playable for other people and teachable for other people. Our students get sometimes so engrossed in the making of the game that they forget this is a game to be played.
To be played, yes. And they also, I mean, for many of them, they get really wrapped up in, if this was an essay, what I would just call purple prose, right? Yeah. It's the kind of banal descriptors of the world rather than the descriptors that would matter. So you get a lot of, it was a cold, dark morning kind of environment, rather than, this is 18th century Boston. This is, a cobbled street. You can hear the market women going down, entering into town, setting up their stalls. So as they're exploring the environment, they don't explore the environment historically. They explore that environment imaginatively. And one of the things that we're hoping to do through this experiment, through this video series, and through the curriculum that we're developing this semester to go along with our courses, is to give them tools, our students, give them the tools to kind of to divide up, right, the creative aspects of the world and the historical aspects of the world. We've given them a lot of freedom, I think, in the past, and that freedom is great because I really enjoy watching the imagination that comes out of this, but it also, I think, it serves as a disservice to the historical learning process, or the historical process that we're asking for them to build here. And so we're building out tools, and we'll share those in the coming weeks, like character sheets. Where I'm been kind of playing with the idea of building a sheet that will help them kind of craft that environment. And the idea here isn't that you're like doing a D&D character sheet or crafting a D&D kind of environment where you're rolling for the character's attributes, but that they'll go to primary sources, look at those primary sources and pull from the experiences of real people, the ability, the aspects of character that they can use to create this composite, or the aspects of the environment that they can use to kind of encircle or envelop the narrative that they're trying to build.
It's, and one of the things you mentioned brought an idea, when you're, because this happens in a lot of games, like the environment itself is not crafted. Like you don't feel like you're in that world. And I often use examples like it's like a novel or it's like a film, right? There's a mood, there's a setting, right? And but I was also thinking at the moment you were saying that, particularly like in our 306 class, which is the Playing the Past, where they learn how to create narrative, then they create a game, and that's an upper division, is, even if I imagine sort of an Assassin's Creed setting, right? You come into it and they have an environment there that situates you in that world, whether it's Boston or Rome or London, right? And you're in that, and they all play these games. But I think to myself, kind of in a metacognitive way, is that I need to remember that showcasing them those moments, that this is what the world looks like. How can you reflect that now in your own game through words, right? If you could take a scene, let's just take a still shot from Assassin's Creed. Now write that. What is there? because now you can include that in your game.
Right.
Like before they made the visual aspects of Assassin's Creed, someone sat down and we need X,
Yeah.
we need Y,
We need to build this world that
right,
looks like this.
and then someone had to do it, and then someone had to see it, right? And there's layers there, and I think that's like we're doing this also because we're talking through some of these issues about how we can discover things, and for me, that's a moment where I think now I can use that tool to then have them think about. Take the visual, make it literal, now make it into a game. Because that environment, that character environment, that visual environment is really important to creating that context versus it was a cold,
dark, stormy night, right? And I could see the breath of the redcoat over the hill. We've had lots of those. Lots of what I call Call of Duty American Revolution, where
goodness.
It's weirdly a first-person shooter,
so much.
but in a Twine narrative fashion.
Yeah, I had one made about the fall of Leningrad once, and it was just a first-person shooter. They said it. It's like a video game that. Well, many do this. Just use the historical backdrop to create a FPS, right? And that's all I'm getting, right?
And no amount of trying to pull them back, no amount of saying, can we reconsider the way you're approaching this? Right. I had one student who was just super resistant. He wrote a game about the Vietnam War, where it really became Call of Duty Vietnam, and he situated the primary character, the player character for this game, as a Marine in Vietnam in 1968, and what it became was almost a My Lai simulator, where he was basically creating an apologia for the behavior of American soldiers in the Vietnam War. And I mean, I suppose one could argue, right, for the validity of that interpretation, but it's not what I was after in these games. And we had office hour meetings. I have several emails about how we approach the war. Oh no, there it goes. Okay, sorry about that. But I saw our camera froze. But there lots of conversations about how we could consider the agency of the Vietnamese village, consider the agency of the Marines themselves, right? Rather than creating this composite heroic character that was typical of a first-person shooter. Think about how many of those Marines themselves were protesting against the war. If you really want to play it the My Lai thing, then let's make it. I don't know. I struggled a lot with that conversation because I don't want to squelch somebody's interpretation on one hand, but I do want them to kind of reel in that kind of nationalism and hegemony of American power, especially if you're dealing with military situations in these games, which has been a big bugbear of my own. And I've just basically recently have just been like, okay, we're just not going to do war in these games anymore. But they're gonna go
to
want
those,
to.
and I know. The part of the thing is in that, these challenges. We have some really good games. We're speaking to kind of the challenges is that I often discuss with my students too. They don't always do it, right? Is the idea of having a discussion between characters so you can lay out some of those disagreements, right? So if you're in a troop anyway, you're going to have an argument or something like this, so you can play those. And so I think students, like the idea of perspective for me, some of them sometimes means telling one perspective, not engaging in the multiplicity of perspectives. Even if you have your single player character, right? The other characters can have discussions
I tried to
letters
suggest that, right? But
whatever it is.
But when you're doing something like that, what you're adding to these games is a complexity from that kind of NPC environment, right? Which that is, I mean, if you really want to talk about the problems, especially in the lower division courses, right? It's getting that richness, and that speaks both to the player creation of choice, but also the creating an environment in which that choice can be made bare, right? So that you might have that, kind of traditional first-person shootery Marine going full bore into a Vietnamese village bent on, right, just mass murder, but then have that conscience character come in and challenge. But that takes a maturity and a sophistication of both historical knowledge and historical empathy. That's that difficult point, and I think what has been really the impetus towards trying to create these tools that will engage students in those questions before they even sit down to write the narrative.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole, I guess, to back up and to kind of situate what Sean was saying is the whole impetus for a lot of this was to get students to struggle with understanding the production of history.
Right.
And they do.
Right. For sure.
And, to highlight, I think, what are successes, even if the games don't always meet what we would think are the best standards, we know that A, they have struggled with a portion of historical thought, B, done more research than they've
ever
probably done in a history class, except for some of our upper division students, right? Which is a different scenario. And C, come away with some insight about a particular era. And as Sean was mentioning, I think the idea for us is if we could build tools that are clearer, that provide guidance that is streamlined and tangible for our students, then the implementation process might be better, right? And they'll still come away with those skills, those thoughts, those questions, but they and we might be happier with the end production of this. Right. So the goal, the idea is the same. Right. I think it's just to make it richer, right? In many ways. Of course, we want to be doing this as a segue. Do you want to show this?
Yeah, I think maybe show off a couple of our students' games. These games are on our website. We haven't curated these in a while. A lot of these come from our first experience, which is, I think it's good for us to reflect on these in some ways as well. But on our website, which is at criticalplay.org, if you click through the games pedagogy tab on the front page, you will be introduced to this page of games, and as you can see here, this comes from Jeff's 2018 lower division, which is
not our first iteration, but
it's pretty close to the earliest of them. But you can see, again, one of the things that we are really proud of our students for doing is they find topics and characters that speak to them and that speak to stories that often aren't told in the traditional history classes that they've had before. So you can see in this instance, right, just this handful of games here, you have female characters and Native American characters highlighted in the role. As we go down, right, this group wrote about the Tulsa riots well before The Watchmen ever was a thing on television, and people became kind of aware of Tulsa in popular culture, right? And again, Native Americans. This is a game we shouldn't even talk about.
There's many of those. We also put up examples that aren't
great,
the best, because we want to share and people to learn from
learn from these, and for us, again, it's a really interesting, I think, sometimes it's good for us to reflect back on some of
Minor
these
1849.
on some of these games, so that we can, so that we can hone our craft and think about ways that we can make the pedagogy stronger. So I mean, just giving you a sense of like one of these games, we'll use
Maybe not too much.
No.
Okay.
I don't want to. I mean, and here, you have this kind of wall of text that this student has gone into, or group of students.
Yeah.
Okay. But they're trying their best to really kind of set the exposition for the story. And I think this is partly our fault, asking them to set the exposition in the story. But that exposition is often not done in the service of a gameplay. Instead, it's like reading an opening chapter, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things. It could be hard for anything, is how do you start? Where do you start? And I have to go back to novels, but I think another way is to go back to like how does a game start?
Right.
Even if it's a visual game, like where are you? A lot of students, I talk to my students about making characters that are interesting, that you want to play, that you want, if not be, you're interesting in the outcome of their experiences.
Right.
And sometimes for them that means doing things with their family, but making that family experience just kind of generalized and not making it specific to the era, like you were talking about earlier, right? And so that there's an attempt here,
right.
But at the same time, it's it is a wall of text, which our students sometimes, when they're trying to tell a story, find that an easier way because that's what they're used to, or they become they just use simple choices throughout the sort of binary condition of what you're going to do.
Right, and so like here's a really good example, right? I mean, I clearly, this is a 172. This is a lower division survey course. These are freshmen writers. So so to me, this is pretty impressive.
It is.
And incredibly awesome, because I mean, it's clear they understand the context of the Civil War. It's clear they understand the choices that, in this case, women had to make. It's clear they understood what a Civil War camp follower was and
did some research.
Might have been like, right? But rather than engaging, right, in kind of making the narrative give these choices to the character, they simply just flump the choices into right at the end, and it just becomes, all right, we're going to follow our husband, we're going to follow our husband, we're going to follow our son, or we're going to stay at home, right? And there's this kind of binary set of choices that we know historically that's not how lives work, right? Somebody doesn't put a sign up and say, okay, now take this path, that path, or this path, right? And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, and I can't speak to what Jeff's motivation here, is to try to make these narratives feel more natural in the way that choice is determined, so that you're not signposting the choices like this, but that something occurs in text that
changes,
pushes towards one of these.
I concur. And they were attempting, I mean, here, like, this is supposed to convince you, but they could have had something here to say, then go that way. Right?
He took a bullet. He took a bullet to the shoulder. He's suffering, and you don't want to see him suffering, so it's going to force you to into that decision or whatever it might be. And this is where it gets into leveraging Twine in a way that especially our freshman writers aren't necessarily too comfortable with. But I will say that with the freshman classes, one of the benefits that we have there is that we're not dealing with history majors. No, and that's, I mean, so that you might have a computer
I
science.
need a shirt that
right?
says that. Don't deal with history majors.
Exactly. But you might have a student who is in computer science, or a student who's in electrical engineering, who has
A skill set that is
not
beneficial.
either a skill set or at least the kind of intellectual curiosity
Yeah.
to want to engage in the kind of behind the scenes Twine stuff,
Right.
where you have your liberal arts majors who will be more interested in the front, and you can divide that up in a way that I think is fun and kind of interesting.
What you're saying, Sean, is that the upper division history students have been so indoctrinated with the writing of text that doing something different,
is a challenge.
is a challenge.
Right, and thus they should take 305. That's our methods class, our digital methods class, before they embark on
But it's fair to some degree,
Yeah.
right? And it's a skill set that is beneficial for history majors and others, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, this is kind of where we're getting. It's just this binary choice here. It just, to me, is right. Take part in the war by serving in the army,
So this is,
becoming. But again, 172. They now know
that
women had agency in the Civil War,
there was some
and that there was choice,
but also that this agency was limited to a certain
set of conditions. Yeah, I mean, and right, that is that's a takeaway from a lower division course. That's, to me, pretty successful and awesomely sophisticated. That isn't, just the Civil War was a war of slavery, and that So to me, I this is why we're continuing to do this, right? There is, while there might be problems with the way that these
like any
students
paper,
approach it,
there's issues, right?
Yeah.
But so how do we smooth those out? And I think here versus a traditional paper is we have a lot of spaces to really
get in there and
shape,
mold
these things. So segue.
Right.
This gets to our Sean and I discussion where how can we do this? What is a way that would best serve our interests? And so we had been talking. We talk a lot, and we've been talking about. Well, I don't know what it was. Probably after a conference, and we were drinking or something, and we said, let's just make a game. Let's make a game, and we're gonna build it out, and we're gonna show students not just our partial games, not our little games, not like here's like I can make a game in 5 minutes that does all sorts of things for my students, but let's just do it.
Let's model the whole thing.
And make it like we would make it. And so we came up with some ideas, and we threw out a number of scenarios that we could probably use. And then Sean said, well, that's stupid. We already made a game. So why don't we use that as a template? And so years ago, there's a game came to be known, it's over there, called April 14th, or the Lincoln Game. And it's a card game. And the function of the game was to teach about social class, different types of communication and interaction, gender, race, and in the game, like you can be certain characters of different classes, but you can't communicate with other characters because if you're a maid, you're not communicating with
the elite,
this. And so then the idea of the students would learn that your communication isn't open-ended, right? And then it was also connected to that sort of, butterfly theory that, your choices in the end could shape other things. And that is the Lincoln of murder. So Lincoln's not even in the game. He's not even part of the game, but the murder's going to happen, right? And can you accidentally kind of stop it through your...
Can you stumble into the conspiracy and, through your character's position in society,
but you're collecting information, you're collecting ideas,
and this was a game that was conceived of at DHSI, the Digital History Summer Institute, I think in 2016 or 2017
maybe,
and we had taken one of the games courses together, and as kind of an introduction to the Summer Institute. And as we were working through the games course and thinking about these, we had conceived of this game where you wake up and it was meant to be this. It was always meant to be a video game. And in our minds, the way that we had initially kind of conceived of it was a kind of self-discovery game, where the player wakes up and discovers things about their character, right? Their position in society, that what they have access to, etc. And as they did so, they were collecting information that then might help either propel them into the conspiracy or help them stop the conspiracy to murder Lincoln. But at the time, we didn't know of Twine.
Or if we did, we didn't conceive that we were going to use it that way. And we'd have actually imagined it. Can we get some way to
how do we
it?
build this? We started thinking about Unity.
Why not? All
right? Because we can learn that in the summer. And then we went and took a Unity class and learned how to make a ball roll across
we didn't try very hard,
the 3D plane. But that game kind of morphed into the card game. That is, I think, a pretty fantastic game, and we've play tested it with a lot of students and have had a lot of fun with it, and it still sits on a shelf, and we need to revisit it
play it again
and do some things with it.
When I re-looked at it after we talked about it, I was like, this really is a fun game. That's a lot, but it's like, it works.
And we played it with students, and students have all enjoyed it. And I think there's some takeaways in there as we've debriefed them in various playtests and playtesting. So that's going to become that's going to provide kind of the core backdrop.
Well, the key was when you said, and I hadn't even thought about it, was there's all this research that's gone into, because the game itself is research. The cards
are primary source
they are
research.
Primary sources, right? They that are part of them. So the research is done through characters, through just kind of daily things that are happening around in Washington, D.C. and about the war itself. So there's a template there that we can incorporate already into a Twine game.
Yeah, and show students how you not only can you do the research, but how you bring that research into the creation of character, the creation of environment, the creation of choice, and that. And so we have now this kind of 19th century backdrop that we are going to play around with, and that's going to provide the kind of the core setting for the game as we reconceive what is now a card game into what is essentially an interactive fiction game, or interactive semi-fiction game. Right, this is the hard part for our students again to wrap their heads around, is that we're creating a fictive universe or a fictive space and fictive characters, but at the same time engaged in the real 19th century. So it's at the production, I think we've said this in other places and in other publications and things, right? The history learning is really happening in the production of the game, not in the playing of the game. The playing of the game can deliver some historical benefit to our students, but the real kind of historical pedagogy comes in the creation of the game, the research that goes into it, the adaptation of that research into these fictive spaces, these probable spaces. And we know that our students have, not only have they expressed their excitement about the games, but we've also had instances, and I like to bring this up I think every time we talk about these things, where students will come back, and if I put a game online, like in one of the showcases that we have attached to our website, and they see a mistake in it, they'll email me and continue to want to work on it, right? This is a project that I had a student contact me over the summer and was asking if the game still existed somewhere, and if I could get it to them, because they wanted to revisit some of the things that they were doing with it. And I've never in my entire career had a student say, hey, can I have that midterm back? I really want to rewrite it on my own and do something with it, right? So we know that it's an effective pedagogical tool, especially for those who kind of really get into it. But we've also seen, and a lot of it's anecdotal evidence, but we've seen quite a bit of growth amongst our students in these classes. And I mean, there is, I think, probably a long conversation to be had about kind of content and
I think that, I mean, part of this process is so that students and others can see how we work through that. Like, right. Particularly, in our upper division classes, which are different than our lower division, we ask our upper division students, I know I do, I presume Sean does, that bring whatever you're working on. If you're working on a paper in 301 or another class or 499, these are like where they do big projects, bring that and use that. So you have some of that done, because you can take that. I mean, it is tricky to shape it into something. And part of this, to go back, is to show students, okay, here we're doing it. We have something. It's not even a paper. It's a card game. Yeah. Right? How do we make this into something? Now, the interesting thing is in it, like in the card game, there's a possibility. I forget the stats, but it's like a 15-20% possibility that you can stop the assassination of Lincoln. It's pretty low. You can capture the Confederate conspirators, possibly, but our game probably won't have that counterfactual in it, but we can change that. We can script it in a way where you as a character are still experiencing all these moments. You're experiencing the environment. You're experiencing the political atmosphere around you, and the tragedy that happens with the assassination then becomes part of that holistic experience, the contextualization of how would a person, who's a maid versus someone who's enslaved versus someone who's a lawyer or someone who has Confederate sympathies, like how would they experience these different emotions towards what's happened or happening in mid 1865, and to share that with students so they can see. I think the key point is not see only how it's done, but how we argue over how it's going to be done. And I don't mean like argue, but we have to make choices about what happens. And then, like, to not jump ahead, but when we're going to be doing this, and we're going to, be adding a lot of variables and a lot of other coding into it to make it an interesting game, right? And we want our students to see that this is not that hard, that if you make these simple things at the beginning of the game, these will follow you, and your story will have a real interesting kind of deep backdrop to it, versus just having those binary choices, and that eventually just become like a tree stump, right?
And it just makes you and then so I think those are the reasons that we're kind of doing this game. And one of the things that I was just kind of heading back to, one of the ideas that I always bounce off, and Jeff is concerned about this, but he never is as concerned as I am with it
about anything.
No, it's that one. So for 172, 170 for our survey courses, right? There's that coverage. It's a coverage content argument, depth versus breadth, where I am really proud of the work that students do on these games, and they get and report a tremendous amount of value from a very limited scope of history, right? They get depth out of this rather than that kind of breadth of knowledge that the survey is often intended to encapsulate. So for and there's a kind of constant push-pull in that, both in my own kind of desire for breadth. Story. I like
just
words.
Change the word survey
to in depth. But for a lot of our students, this is the only history they're going to have.
Well, there's also complaints about that too.
Yeah,
I mean, and I don't know if that's built upon a set of expectations,
right?
right? Because it's not like at the end of the day they're going to have to take some university test about whether they got the breadth or not, right?
But I think there's a general interest in some of them for some of that breadth, right? To get to the things that are of interest to them. And I'd like to think that having them do the game
was the interest point.
Is the interest point, right? That's where they find that interest point. So for me, there's a delicacy in this, and I'm teaching a version of this course this semester where I am involved in doing this gaming thing. The class itself, the first half, I'm treating kind of like a traditional, and they're going to have a midterm that does everything that a traditional class was going to do, and then the second half, the last 8 weeks of the course, are going to be this gaming experiment. So I'm giving them the breadth up front and hopefully the depth at the end, but within that depth there's also the challenge of getting students to not all want to do the same topic.
Well, we had talked about this before, and it's different than 306 that I'm teaching now, which is the upper division class. They're going to pick different areas because they all specialize in different things. And I don't know if you want to do this, but I'm not doing it in my. I have an oversized section. It's way too hard to do in a big section, but give them 10 options, not of specific subjects, but of an era.
Right.
And let's say an era can only be used twice or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know.
I've done it that way. One of the things that, and Jeff and I have talked about this in the last couple of weeks, one of the things that I was thinking about, and it might come into this curriculum development conversation because I'm going to have to build this out for them this semester anyway. We had talked about creating for the 170 for the survey course a kind of package, a prepackaged model or prepackaged
set of sources that they can then, because the part of it with 172 they don't have, how do you do all this research to make a game when you're not a history major and you don't even even if you were a history major when you're a freshman, you don't know all the resources to do research. So if we can give a packet of primary sources,
here is your suffragettes,
and you can add to it, but we've given you a basis where you don't have to spend the hours to find this.
And I think this is the direction I'm taking that curriculum development. So part of what we're doing is going to be geared towards Jeff's upper division 306, and the final production in that class is a game. The other curriculum development is going to be more for the survey side of things, and I think I'm going to be working on that. But there are steps along the way that we think are embedded just in this Twine curriculum that will be common for both. So if you have an interest in lower division curriculum, we'll be here for you. If you have an interest in kind of upper division history curriculum, we're going to be here doing that. But we're probably going to be starting with some of the more basic elements of the game, which is to refine the proposal and character development assignments that we had initially assigned with some new ideas using pre-drafted character sheets and other things of that nature. And that's where we're going to pick up with this series either next week or maybe every other week. We haven't quite decided on a schedule for this yet. But as we do, it'll become a kind of regular series because we've got to get this work done for our students.
We've got to get it done. And I think, the building of those templates, it's for your information if you're interested. We do teach a course every year at DHSI, the Digital History Summers Institute at University of Victoria. And some of our ideas come out of there too. Mm-hmm. The course is really great, not only because what we may be able to impart to people, but what we learn from the other participants in our courses. Particularly even about narrative design and creation, has been really helpful. And, one of the things for sure is that giving the students, whomever they may be, a clear set of parameters to start. And that's what we're really we're breaking it down to now, is making those parameters clear and then showcasing
in some ways we're dialing back the freedom that we gave the original.
Yeah, but you know,
but with more,
too many choices are too many choices.
Too many choices, exactly.
Right,
yeah. And we've seen the struggle. We've seen students struggling with it. And to be fair, if anybody wants more freedom, we can always take them off the leash.
Yeah.
But I think for those students who had wanted more kind of hand holding and more of a structured environment in which to create these, that's where we're heading with this.
It's like an RPG, right? There needs to be some structure.
There needs to be a game. There needs to be a dungeon master or a game master.
Yeah, there has to be something there to give you parameters to work within, right? And we need better parameters.
We had given those parameters, but they had been pretty loose. We'll show some examples in the next time we do this of some of the older prompts that we were using for this.
We'll tear ourselves down,
and how we're trying to improve on those prompts. So if you have any interest in this at all, you can join us back here. We'll probably be Twine twitching every other Thursday.
Thursday or Tuesday.
Yeah, around 2:00, depending on kind of what's going on. If you follow us on Twitter or Instagram, we'll make announcements there before we go live. But these will also be cut down and edited and put up on our YouTube channel as well. You can just search for criticalplay.org on or the CSULB Center for the History of Video Games on YouTube, and you'll find us. We aren't special enough to have a direct link yet. So cool. Thanks for joining us. If you did this time around, it's been fun talking.
Yes. So we will be back.
Yeah. Bye.